Grassroots presents Beyond Business.
Hello and welcome to Beyond Business, where we look at new trends in the global economy. Some call it land grabbing, others say it's a fair business opportunity that helps the world to grow more food. Today we're looking at how multinational companies and some governments are snapping up land in sub-Saharan Africa. Global food prices have risen and the demand for biofuels is on the up, and that's made farmland a golden investment opportunity. Those in favour say it leads to bigger harvests and new jobs, but the critics say local farmers and communities are being shortchanged. In a moment, we'll discuss the issues here in the studio, but first, here's a snapshot from Benin in West Africa. As multinational companies are moving in, campaigners there are warning about the consequences.
Joseph has always worked on the land, specifically on this land in Benin, which he inherited from his father. It's how he feeds his family. Joseph's 10 hectares are in demand. Not a day goes by without someone offering to buy them.
People come here, they keep on coming. They're always showing up, especially because my land is next to a spring which never runs dry. I don't want to sell my land because I live here. And I know what's going on all across this area. I know what's become of people who've sold up. A farmer who has sold his land is like a soldier who has sold his weapon.
So who are these buyers? Many are multinational companies represented by local intermediaries, and according to villagers, they promise fabulous returns for those who sell.
There are even people who come and tell us, if you sell your land, we'll set up a business here and employ you and your children. There'll be this, there'll be that. But these are just utopian stories.
Julien believed the stories, or rather, he was forced to believe them. He used to be a farmer. We met him next to what was once his plot of land. He tells us how a man from Benin came and warned him that he was going to be thrown off his farm and that he'd be well advised to sell. Several people continued the pressure until finally Julien gave in and sold the land for around half its real value. When we spoke to him, he hadn't even received all of that payment. So Julien is now a farmer with no land. He's surviving by running a motorbike taxi. He's no longer allowed near his old farm, which is guarded at all times. The new owners grow rice, and further off, out of view, they've planted palms to produce oil for biofuel. It was a political leader from within Benin who oversaw the transaction over Julien's land. He's promoting contracts to lease land for 25, 99 and even 125 years.
I'm looking for multinationals which need land, to help them sign contracts. I'm looking, but I haven't found any yet. If I find them, I accompany them and drive them to the land. We look at everything, what they want to grow, what kind of land they need. I've got different kinds. If it's right, I can offer them an area of 10,000 hectares, 20,000 hectares, or even 100,000 hectares for their needs.
Some, however, find this approach scandalous. Jeanne has worked for years as an activist for an international farming charity, campaigning against what they call the land grab.
For us, this government's giving the green light to foreigners to come and take Benin's land. Actually, it's more than that. The government is showing them the steps to take to destroy the local way of life. There are some who say, we're not selling, we're only leasing the land. But if you lease the land for 99 or 125 years, doesn't it come down to the same thing?
Jeanne isn't only worried about land rights. For her, there are other serious consequences.
The second danger, in my view, is that to give the land to multinationals, to foreigners, favours industrial-scale farming. So that means single crop cultivation, and that destroys local biodiversity. Then the third danger, I think, is the question of food sovereignty. If small farmers no longer have their own land to produce their own crops, then their control over their food supply is weakened. And they have to rely on what the multinationals produce.
Jeanne and her colleagues say they're fighting against a form of neo-colonialism. They're hoping to mobilise public opinion against what many feel is a farmland hold-up before it's too late.
All right, joining us now for more is Jonathan Brooks, who's a senior economist at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, more commonly known under the abbreviation OECD. Thanks very much for speaking to us here at France 24. First of all, what's driving this development? Why has land become such an investment opportunity by the looks of it?
Well, I think what's really driving it is the basic global arithmetic. We have a world population of 6 billion people at the moment that's expected to rise to 9 billion by 2050. So that's a 50% increase in the world population. If you add in rising incomes across the world, that's likely to translate into something like a 70% increase in the demand for food that will have to be met by supply from somewhere. And I think what that translates into is a very positive assessment of the outlook for agricultural markets.
Now, what's the typical profile of a land buyer in these cases? Are we talking about state actors, or are we talking about private enterprise for the most part?
Well, most of the actual transactions that are being concluded at the moment are in fact by private companies. I think the profile of these private companies is somewhat different to what you and I would think of as being an agricultural investor. We would often have thought of agribusiness companies investing in products for markets, whereas what we're seeing now is institutional investors who are investing in the asset of land and seeking resources to a greater extent than seeking markets. Although it's mostly private agents that are driving it, in many cases there's heavy state involvement at the back of that, and a lot of the push that's coming from governments is because of their own concerns about food security. I mentioned that there's a growing demand for food in the world, but what's going to happen is that many of the countries in which we'll see income growth don't have agricultural potential, and so what they're doing is they're seeking out land to make sure that they can grow enough food for themselves. So there's a strong possibility that there's a state involvement behind these private enterprises. I think one of the issues as well is that with governments, in principle, they should be able to get food on the world market, but at the moment, with the recent experience of the increase in food prices in 2007 and 2008, they're not so confident. They don't feel that they can actually trust world markets. And in many cases in 2007-8, one of the problems was that countries, when prices went up, exporting countries put restraints on exports, which depressed prices locally, but it meant if you had to buy on the world market, the price went up further. So there was a big loss of confidence in world markets, and I think that's another motivating factor.
Let's talk about specific examples here. Let's bring in a map of the globe and a map of some of the main players in the world, the buyers and their target countries. In between what countries do we see the most buying and selling, if we take a look at this map?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is shaded in blue. We would see a number of industrialized countries, North America, Europe, which we traditionally associate with making investments in agriculture. But we also see countries that are investing that are actually in the southern part of the world, in Africa here, South America, India, that are actually making investments overseas to address their own food security concerns. So it's not purely a case of rich countries investing in poorer countries.
It's
in
not
many
as simple
cases,
as a north-south relationship.
No, it certainly isn't, and a lot of it is about south-south types of investments. My understanding is that the information at the moment on the exact extent of these deals is still somewhat sporadic, but big players at the moment include China, which has concerns about its ability to grow enough food, and the Gulf states as well.
Now, if we look then at the benefits of all of this, are there benefits? The report told us about a lot of the drawbacks, but there must be benefits as well, right?
I think in principle that's right. If you look, for example, if you look at African agriculture has been starved of investment for decades. And in order for the world to feed itself by 2050, there are estimates that there's a need for as much as $80 billion a year of investment. Now, that is a huge amount. And if you look at where that money's going to come from, African countries in many cases don't have a great deal of their own domestic resources. They spend less than 10% of their budgets on agriculture. Aid has been declining, although there's some commitment to reverse that trend, but aid is relatively small, and microfinance only has a limited role. So foreign investment in terms of developing African agriculture has to play an essential role. If it can do that, if it's done properly, it can provide jobs, it can help upgrade the infrastructure, it can bring new technologies. There are so many benefits that it can potentially offer, but of course it does need to be done correctly, and if it's not done correctly, we see the kinds of problems that were alluded to here. People getting kicked off their land, food getting produced and then sent for export elsewhere, so it doesn't stay within the local economy, and generally very adverse consequences for the domestic economy. So it very much depends on the way in which it's done.
Now, very briefly, I would like to ask you about, some people say that there needs to be a code of conduct here for buyer countries. Do you agree with that?
I think a code of conduct makes a lot of sense. I think that there's a need to make sure that due process is respected. There's a lot of concern about a lack of transparency in these operations. There's a lot of concern about asymmetric bargaining power, where the recipient country doesn't quite know what it's getting into, or perhaps somebody as an intermediary is benefiting from the transaction but not the people on the ground. So there are lots of concerns about process, and then there are concerns about the economics of it. What are the economics? Who is going to benefit from this? What will be the social impacts? What happens to people on their land? Will they get kicked off their land, or does it in fact offer different opportunities? So a code of conduct would make some sense in addressing those things.
All right, Jonathan Brooks from the OECD, thanks very much for speaking to us today.
My pleasure.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Beyond Business. Do stay with us here at France 24.
Beyond Business, presented by Grassroots.